Hello! This is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you're watching on, assuming that you're watching live, and they should show up here in my chat room. And, I try to work out the subjects I'm going to talk about in advance. I would like to work out the whole week in advance, and occasionally I pull that off. But very often what happens is I wake up in the morning and say to myself, oh my God, what am I going to talk about today? And today was one of those days. And hello to Reverend Michael in the chat room. It's good to see you, Michael. I've been talking a lot about politics lately. And I really didn't want to continue necessarily a political theme, but we're going to. And today we're going to talk about the concept of justification. And why? And hello to Janet in the chat room. Why are we going to talk about justification? Well, there are two reasons. The first is a couple of days ago on his page, Ed the Pagan had a posting saying, I refuse to justify my existence as a pagan to anyone, and neither should you. This, of course, then became subject of conversation between Edward and myself, and was also echoed in something that happened over the weekend. I received an internet call, which I almost never answer if I'm not expecting it, but on this day, for whatever reason, I was weak, and I answered the call, and the person gave me greetings in the name of Jesus Christ. And although it didn't turn out to be an especially bad conversation because I didn't allow it to be, it ties directly into this subject because that's likely where it would have been going if I were not skilled in what I do. Now, of course, I know that I could attract a much wider and more enthusiastic, well, maybe not more enthusiastic, because I have an enthusiastic audience, and I love that. But a wider audience, if I were to talk about oogie boogie things, if I were to talk about demon possession and haunted dolls and stuff like that, I get lots more listeners. But, that really just doesn't work for me. I have thought about doing some programs that touch on that for that exact reason. But, I just could not do the stupid oogie boogie presentation that we so often see. I would have to talk about it in a serious manner, and I don't know if anybody really wants to hear that. And only a certain number of people want to hear about these serious matters that we face as a community, the serious things we do as a community. But still, that's my skill to speak on, so that's what I speak on. Whether I'm talking about things like numerology and astrology, I'm going to talk about them from a serious, real point of view. And if I'm going to talk about politics, I'm going to talk about that from a serious, real point of view. Hello to Fox Fur Witch. Today, we're going to talk about justification. What does justification mean? That is where you find yourself defending your right to be whatever it is that you are in a conversation with someone else. And I do want to emphasize, before I go any farther, I'm talking about not justifying your right to exist, which I think you should never, ever do. And hello to Mary Hawk in the chat room. I'm not talking about never justifying your actions. It's a different subject. But your right to exist, you should not have to justify to anyone, and you should not. And there are a number of reasons for that. And the first and most important one is that the moment you engage in that conversation, you have allowed that person the right to decide if you have a right to exist. Merely giving them the right to make that decision is the big mistake. When it comes to justifying yourself as a pagan, You should not do that. You should say, I have the right to be a pagan. That's all there is to it. Now, if you want to elucidate on the nature of the religion, that's another matter. That's not justification. If you want to talk about what we do or what we don't do, though it's always better to talk about what we do, that's fine. That's not justifying your existence. Justifying your existence is accepting the idea that the person and or their movement has a right to pass judgment over your existence, and usually means arguing it in their terms. One of the things that Christian nationalists, for example, love to do is get people to argue the Bible with them. And an awful large number of pagans actually know the Bible better than most Christians, and they will fall for this red herring. And why should you not do it? Especially if you know you're right. Well, first, you're acknowledging the Bible as the authority. Once you've done that, it's very hard to get back out from under that in that conversation. Two, of course, you're acknowledging their right to judge your existence using that criteria. No other criteria will be able to get into that argument afterwards. And third, they're going to interpret it the way they want to interpret it. And there's an old saying, and I mentioned it on Friday, do not argue with fools because they will drag you down to their level and beat you with their experience. That's what this kind of argument is about. That's part of the reason you should not take part in it. Again, I'm certainly not saying you should never justify your actions. There may be times when that is appropriate. But your right to exist, who has a right to decide if you have a right to exist as the person that you are? Arguing it with them is conceding their right. So one of the reasons I hate the term alternative religion or alternative spirituality or pretty much alternative anything, because what it basically says is that you are an alternative to the real thing. You're an alternative to the legitimate thing. You're an alternative to the normal thing. It is a losing position from the time you accept the word. And yes, I know there'll be people saying, oh, that's not what it means. But it doesn't matter what it means. It's what they hear. This is why I talk so much about interfaith language. It does not matter if you know that a word means one thing, if your listener thinks it means something else and will only accept that meaning. You must pay attention to what your listener can hear. And I assure you, if you attempt to justify your right to exist, they're going to hear that you're giving them the authority to decide if you have the right to exist. Doesn't matter whether you're seeing it that way or not. So my advice is to be like Ed the Pagan. Do not justify your right to exist, whether you're speaking as a pagan or as part of the LGBTQ community or as part of any minority whatsoever. You never should justify your right to exist. You can talk about the good things in your community. You can talk about the things that you do. You can talk about all kinds of things that never allow a question of your right to exist. But if you allow that question and you cooperate with it, you're drastically undercutting yourself. And you need to pay attention to that. This is also one of the reasons that I often argue against when people want to talk about being weird or not normal or various other terms. And they will say, but to us, that has a positive meaning. That may be, but does it to your audience? Does it have that meaning to the people who are listening to you? And what is normal? I was taught that normal is what we strive to rise above. Normal is the lowest common denominator of the population. It's what most people have in common. And that is well under excellence and not really the thing that you should be copying in the first place. The things that for some people would make me weird, I always thought it was making me excellent. being well educated, being well read. I find it very hard to believe that anyone who has these qualities can see them as being bad. Um, it is, in my opinion, something we should be very proud of, and we should use words that express that pride, and not words that other people use for denigration. And yes, I get the idea of taking back the word and taking the pain out of it and blah, 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 and that is good in its place. Um, but that can also be turned back against you. And if we think of certain prominent slurs that I'm not going to mention, but certain slurs that are used against the African American community or against the gay community, which communities have taken back those terms to use in positive ways, but still have them used against them in very damaging ways. My advice is, instead of thinking of yourself as being weird or abnormal or the black sheep, you think of yourself as being excellent, above normal, or the exemplary sheep of the family, and not accept those judgments. Because the problem is, if you accept the judgment, you at least lead them to believe they have the power to enforce the judgment. Now, they may have the power either way. We were talking about that on Friday. We've been talking about that for a while. We are looking at a situation where the enemies of our community, whichever of these communities you may belong to, are very close to having the power, and in many cases already do, to marginalize our communities again. But that doesn't mean we should concede that. That doesn't mean that we should in any way lead them to believe we agree with that. And it does not mean that that we should give up our fights. We must continue them. And part of that is standing proud in our own right. Part of that is not accepting that outside judgment, which is why we should not justify our existence. When he says, if someone calls me weird, I know I'm doing it right. Well, that may be, but that's not what they mean. But, what can be said? People are going to do what they want to do. But I'm telling you, this is a losing bet. You're accepting the external judgment that you think you're rejecting. I remember about 1980, there was a scandal involving Texas cheerleaders who were having, I think, an unusual level of pregnancy or some unwed pregnancy or something else in their local high school. And they had people on this talk show talking about how cheerleaders are role models to young women. And I remember sitting there thinking, what? What world do you live in? How is a cheerleader a role model? I mean, perhaps a nice art form, but a role model? Did you not see the movie Satan's Cheerleaders? Did you not see Debbie Does Dallas? Did you not see all those cheerleader movies in the 70s that basically extremely sexualized cheerleaders? Do you not realize that's how people were looking at them in 1980? Maybe not now. I don't really pay attention to cheerleaders. But, a lot of people accept that idea that the jock and the popular girl, then the cheerleader, are somehow a role model or what you should be. I never did. And I really think that you should look at that and ask yourself, do I buy that? Now, Gwynnie says, I also follow that with who wants to be like everyone else? Well, as I say, normal is what you strive to rise above. If someone thinks you're weird, my answer is no, I'm excellent. I'm above average. I could never lower myself to be merely normal. And I think that it's a better way of looking at it. Maybe Maybe we might want to choose some more modest terms, but it's true. I was in school the person who, by the time I got to middle school, had already read Shakespeare and the Iliad and the Odyssey and all kinds of other advanced literature, who was familiar with Renaissance art and Baroque art. Now, Mary Hawk says normal is a setting on the washer. Yes, it is. And again, it's also the lowest common denominator. Normal is not what anyone should be aiming to be. And Gwynnie says, I like your way better. Thank you, I'm glad. Cat Jones, hello to Cat Jones. Cat Jones, Westover Squires. And she says, I love this. Hi, Lord Don. Thank you, Cat. We must change as a community how we look at ourselves, because far too often we're seeing ourselves through the lens of that wider community and not even through the best part of it. We need to see ourselves through our own standards, and we need to actually believe in our own standards. We need, in my opinion, well, one of the things we're doing at Crellian Publishing, we're doing all kinds of children's literature now. And, I think this is something that needs to be reflected in our educational materials, in our literature, a better way of seeing ourselves and a better way of being. And certainly not a negative comparison to the wider world. And Mary says, normal is boring. Well, yeah, it kind of is. And, simply because you have an interest that is not shared by the vast majority of people doesn't mean there's something wrong with your interest. It means they are more limited in their mindset. And that is not a virtue. But getting back to the issue of justification, this is all about justification. You don't have to justify your interests, and you don't have to contrast your interests to anyone. I never thought of myself as being odd or weird or anything like that. I thought of myself as being a gentleman, an educated gentleman, who happened to be pagan. And I simply saw it as another characteristic of myself. I saw myself as an educated gentleman who happened to be pagan and happened to be part of the LGBTQ community. Another characteristic of myself that really, in my opinion, never needed justification to anyone. And you should not be justifying yourself either. And again, when you justify yourself in your right to exist, you're giving them permission to judge your right to exist. Now, if we're talking about actions, that's another thing. There are times when it may be necessary or appropriate to justify your actions, but that has nothing to do with who you are or your right to exist. And I'll also add, in certain cases, people may think that you need to justify your right to do something. And it may not be appropriate to justify that either. Because again, you're giving them power over it. But what you're doing, why you're doing it, you might want to talk about that. But your right to do it? Who are they to decide your right to do it? And hello to Steve Taylor in the chat room. It's good to see you, Steve. I've said before, if we don't stand up for our rights, we're not going to have them. And this is one of the ways we need to stand up for ourselves. And it happens in everyday conversation. And we must not let ourselves be marginalized, particularly by people who aren't worthy of marginalizing us. And, I might be, it might be being a little bit of what I'm criticizing in saying that, I'm not impressed by, quote, normal. And I don't consider the normal ideal as having the right to pass judgment over. in no uncertain terms. Um, they're not at a level where I'm prepared to accept their judgment, and I don't feel they have any business making it. Again, I could probably put that more modestly, but that's very much how I feel about it. And, I think that as a community, we need to be maybe a little closer to that mindset. When Christian nationalists want to judge our right to exist, I think our part of our response should be, you have no right to make such a judgment. You do not merit such a judgment. You're not even, you do not have a political right. You also don't have a moral right. Because, Christian nationalists violating their own teachings are so common as to be a comedic trope. And they use judgment over other people largely in no small part to distract from judgment over themselves. And I'm not saying we should behave in the same way, but I think we maybe need to be a little bit more assertive about enforcing and standing up for our own rights. Because as far as they're concerned, they don't feel we have them. And they would love to get us involved in situations where we're trying to justify ourselves to them, because we can't, because nothing we say will cause them to change their mind. So they know if they get us into that conversation, they will win it. It's like the pillow guy. What's his name? Mike Pillow Person, who offered, what was it, $1 million, or was it $5 million, whatever it was, to anyone who could prove what he was saying was wrong. And then someone came forward with absolute proof that what he was saying was wrong. And he refused to pay the judgment because he simply would not accept it. I would say the same thing about the amazing Randy, who offered $1 million to anyone who could prove the existence of psychic phenomena, but he was in charge of the judges. And of course, nobody could ever win it. Because no judge who was sufficiently open-minded to accept any evidence could ever be involved. That's how these conversations are. Nothing you say is going to win them over, so don't get in the conversation. Don't try to justify yourself, because you can't. And in trying to, you're acknowledging their right to pass the judgment. This is probably something we need to talk about more, but it all comes down to moral equivalency. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of moral equivalency. And to be morally equivalent is the idea that two things have the same moral value. And that neither one of them is morally superior or morally inferior to the other. And, this is what we need to keep our eye on, our own moral equivalence. And it's something we overlook far too often. And when we take part in conversations where we are accepting outer judgments, we're throwing our moral equivalency out the window. If anything, rather than accepting that wider idea of what is normal, if we do enter into a conversation, we should be bringing our idea of what is appropriate into that conversation, not acquiescing to theirs. It's going to make the conversation probably significantly less friendly, but it's not going to be friendly in the first place, because no conversation that requires you to justify yourself in any way is going to be a friendly conversation. One of my favorite paraphrases, it is a paraphrase, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's from William Baldwin, the great writer. And I often see variations of this. It's very popular these days to say, we can disagree and we'll still be friends because I'm an adult. But the quote is, we can disagree and still love each other. as long as what we disagree on is not my fundamental right to exist. So yeah, we can disagree on a lot of things and still be friends. We can disagree on a lot of things and still love each other, but my fundamental right to exist is not one of them. And if you do not acknowledge my right to exist, we do not love each other. We are not friends. And we are not going to get along beyond basic civility. It is not acceptable for you to question my right to exist. Now, there may be other things that are perfectly discussable, but my right to exist is not one of them. And I think every one of you should take that same point of view. Your right to exist is absolute. Your right to exist as a pagan is absolute. There is no need to justify it, because no other person has the right to make that choice. And if they do, they need to be verbally slapped down if they think they have that right. Your right to be part of a given ethnicity is absolute. No one has any right to judge you on that. There might be other things they might have a right to judge you on, but simply who you were born? Absolutely not. You should never allow anyone to represent that and get away with it. If you're part of the LGBTQ community, you should never allow anyone to think they have a right to pass judgment on whether you have a right to exist in that context. You are who you are. It simply is. And yes, I know there are lots of people for all of these things who think they have that right. They might, in some cases, even have the power. God knows they're trying to get the power. But that doesn't mean you should concede it to them. And Fox for Witch, hello, Fox for Witch, if I haven't already said hello, says, you're 100% right about everything you've said, in my opinion. And this is something I always try to pass on. And yeah, it's generally never going to be successful to find yourself drawn into this kind of conversation. And if you must be, then you must be absolutely firm in your position. And going back to the biblical conversation, one of the things that Christian dominionists, Christian nationalists, whatever we're calling them this week, they're always there, love to do is get people into conversations using the Bible to justify positions. And our people are often stupid enough, and it is stupid, to get caught in those conversations. And it's stupid because they'll never accept what you say. And by arguing that as an authority, you've effectively accepted it as an authority, at least for the conversation. It's no longer possible to win the conversation once you've done that. That's one of the reasons they try to push people into that conversation. We have to, as individuals and as a community, we have to be clear in what we believe, be clear in what we stand for, and then stand on it. And, it may be that we fall on it too. But if we're going to fall on what we truly stand for, we will fall just as fast if we don't stand on it. Going back to my favorite example, the 300 pagans who ran and hid in the woods during that long ago festival were no safer for hiding in those woods. They were in fact more exposed, because if the situation with the armed protesters had gone differently and they had actually become violent, they could have hunted all 300 people down in those woods, and when they found them, they'd have been alone. Hiding is not an answer. Standing up for who you are is the only real answer. Will it be a successful answer? Well, that's something apparently we're going to find out. But, in many ways, we've had more success than failure over the years. We claim we believe in magic. We claim we believe in deity. So we have some powerful tools. So we should not be giving up hope, but we do need to realize the situation that we are facing, and that no single act is going to make a difference to it. Only a sustained plan and campaign is going to make any difference to it. Speaking of which, when I talk about this subject, people sometimes ask what they can do. And, I've said several times in this conversation what I think you can do in your daily life. But another thing that I think we can do is come together as a community to talk about this. And the place that I know of that's being prepared to do that is the Pagan World Congress. And if you'd like to find out more about that, you can go to pagan.world and find out more about it. Maybe sign up for it. It is scheduled to be held in October of next year. Why next year? Well, by October of this year, we're not going to know what's happening. It would be before the pattern is clearly set. By next year, we'll have enough knowledge of where the water is flowing to be able to be making plans and time to think about it. But that's one of the things we can do, and I encourage you to do it. The other thing, again, know who you are and stand proud for who you are. So with that, I'm going to wish you a good day. I'll see you tomorrow, and let us close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to be proud of who we are and not allow outside judgments to damage our self-image. Or if outside judgments have damaged our self-image, help us to heal our self-image and help us to reject those outside judgments and stand firm in who we are and what we believe. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we know you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always,